From the Productivity Commission. And earlier, Tom Connell spoke to the Urban Infrastructure Minister, Paul Fletcher.
We intend to appoint an eminent Australian to carry out that review. We're at pains to say that any reforms in this area would be a 10 to 15-year journey. You would only do it if you could be satisfied that it would deliver a better outcome for motorists. And of course, it would need to be agreed to by all of the state and territory governments as well, because the point about our road system, and these are some of the points the Productivity Commission made yesterday, we spend $24–25 billion a year of that order on roads. Now, the revenues that support that expenditure come from the fuel excise, which is a Commonwealth tax. They also come from the motor vehicle registration charges that are charged by state governments. So there's a range of sources that come together. So it's very much both federal and state. Now, the issue is that as vehicles are becoming more fuel efficient, which is a good thing, and as potentially electric vehicles become more of the fleet, which is also a good thing, what that does do is it tends to bring down or at least reduce the rate of growth in the fuel excise revenue.
The other thing you can do with this, I suppose, as well, is manage congestion within cities. If you charge road users, you might be talking about a bigger charge at certain times of the day as well. Once you have that cultural change, you can actually manage what are already pretty clogged roads, presumably.
Look, any issue of pricing for those kinds of objectives would be one for state governments, which have the control over our big cities. What the federal government is interested in is getting underway this review to be conducted by an eminent Australian. And we'll have more to say about that before the end of the year.
Interested, you've got an op-ed piece today talking about infrastructure. You're having a go at the states for essentially a real lack of certainty in some areas. You talk about the Victorian government and East West Link, the fact they cancelled that contract. On the other side of things, you could say the coalition government, when they were in power, signed a contract despite the fact that election was always going to be about whether or not to build that road.
Well, I made the point in my op-ed in the Australian today that a survey carried out by Infrastructure Partnerships Australia looked at the views of investors about Australia as an investment location for infrastructure. And that survey observed that investors commented critically on the fact that we've seen a number of Labor state governments cancel existing contracts for infrastructure. So East-West Link, there was a contract in place, work was underway, and then when the Andrews Labor government came to power, they cancelled that contract. That cost taxpayers in Victoria $1.1 billion, according to Victoria.
But just on that, I understand all of that point, but why would the coalition sign that contract when the election was always going to be, it was dominated by that road and whether or not to build it?
Well, it was the Victorian government of the day that made that decision, and they were carrying out their duty as the government of the day. Can I make the point that the East-West Link was recommended to the Bracks Labor government by Rod Eddington? The need for the East-West Link has been recognised for many years, and indeed just recently Infrastructure Victoria recommended that planning work commence on what is essentially East-West Link. In other words, a connection where there's a gap in the freeway network in Melbourne at the moment. Now that again has been ignored by the Andrews government.
Infrastructure is always a very long-term issue. Infrastructure Australia says if you want any chance of a high-speed rail that's affordable in the future, reserve the corridor. Are you going to do that?
Well, look, what we have announced in relation to the question of faster rail is we've announced a $20 million program under which the Commonwealth has called for proposals for business cases for faster rail between our cities and surrounding regional areas. That announcement was made in the budget, and just recently we've called for those first round proposals. The intention is to select out of those three that we will provide co-funding out of for business cases, up to $7.5 million for each business case. Then at the end of that process, we'll have 3 business cases for faster rail between our cities and surrounding regional areas, and those will then be eligible for funding under the $10 billion that we've committed to spend over the next 10 years on strategic rail projects in our cities and surrounding regional areas.
And it just seems a bit disjointed because when you came to power, you ditched a $52 million fund for high-speed rail, an authority that was supposed to reserve a corridor, look into these types of things.
Can I make this point that What we are specifically doing is focusing on faster rail between our cities and surrounding regional areas. So we think that is the area where energy should be focused. Connections of, say, 100, 150, 200 kilometres between a city and a nearby regional area, so that you can reduce the commuting time, you can make it viable to live in the regional area in obviously more affordable housing but still have access to the capital city job market. And so what we've said in the materials we've put out in relation to this is that we're interested in both evolutionary and revolutionary proposals. Evolutionary might be where you take an existing line and improve a gradient or a curve, electrify a line that's only diesel at the moment, potentially 2 tracks where there's only 1. So that might lead to, say, what's now a 70-minute trip becoming a 55-minute trip. In other words, making it more viable to live in the regional centre and commute into the city for work, be it 5 days a week or maybe 2 or 3 days a week. We're also interested in revolutionary proposals, that's to say using new technology, and we want to test the market and see what's out there.